I'm not a big fan of hour-long speeches. And usually when I get a speaker, if I got a speaker, let's say my political club or a civic club, I usually say to them 10 to 15 minutes. And I don't know that I'm necessarily going to go on 10 to 15 minutes, so I didn't time it when I went through it. But usually I have a sense of how long something is, and I think it's going to be a bit shorter than that. But as Mitch and I scoped this out, we were talking about it being the first 100 days, but when we did the arithmetic, it's 90% of that, so it's the almost first 100 days. And I want to start basically out, and I always like to interject music in my talks, so I'm not going to click on my iPhone as I mention it, but the Doors' second LP was called Strange Days, and it featured a song, People Are Strange. And these are strange days indeed. I think that's one of the phrases, part of the lyrics, as one considers the world around us. And I think we'll have more on that later. But frankly, in my practice, I strategize, I plan, and not all the time, but certainly when things matter. And sometimes, for some matters, I might need to think fast, almost to the point of brinkmanship. But you expect things to occur, and not too often. Because you plan, you think things out, you anticipate, you might also do it in concert, in common cause, using a phrase from the Ferrer campaign that Freddie used since Tony's here, in common cause with others. And when I consider my assessment of the almost first 100 days of the administration of real Donald Trump, because his Twitter handle is @RealDonaldTrump, I see it in administration in crisis mode, like almost all the time. They're more in reaction than thoughtful deliberation. And some argue, and you hear that a lot by the pundits, that campaigns in government remain distinct and that excellence at one mode often fails to equate to the other. And I've been on both sides my entire career, and I never bought into that. And the constituencies sometimes may differ somewhat, but not as much as one would think. And the only distinction, in my view, involves an incoming official and his or her team's knowledge and experience of the processes of government. I recall in a mayoral campaign, and I think it was just out of college at that point, how we were developing briefing papers. And this is in the spring, the primaries in September, general elections in November. We were developing briefing papers that outlined the functions of the various agencies and departments and boards. And that occurred early on. And it aimed not to aid in the transition if the campaign proved successful, but it was really sort of the candidate and would be able to demonstrate a handle on governing to justify that candidate's worthiness. And nothing of that sort seemed to occur with Team Trump from day one. And I often talk about the notion of knowing enough to know what you know not at all. And in the case of this administration, one gets the feeling of being there. That Hersey Kosinski book that was later made into a movie starring the late Peter Sellers. But unlike the Chauncey Gardner character, most Americans and many abroad get no benign feeling, but a borderline fear, I think, perhaps worse. So I want to start with a nod to my good friend Bob Oliveri, who Tony knows, I think Arthur knows, and he's also in Gotham, so some of you may have met him. Bob Oliveri attends more than a few events involving our Constitution, and he loves to raise the sanctity of that document. And I think that document really remains our saving grace in this. What really sets the United States apart as a nation of laws involves how laws protect us from the corrupt, the incompetent, the unknowing, the dangerous. It imposes limits, and thus things can go bad but not worse. It becomes our saving grace. And that's important as we assess the first 100 days, or today, 90% of that run. What always bothered me about politics involved folks looking the other way if someone in the right place would help move an agenda. Thus, we start with GOP senators, House members, and activists who might not think well of the president, his ethics, his competence, etc. Because we're dealing with a situation where the GOP stalwarts really see Trump as a tool to appoint certain types of judges. We already got Judge Gorsuch, and to sign off on certain pieces of legislation and policies. We saw that with the hit on funding Planned Parenthood, which likely will lead to many more abortions as a result of a diminution of family health planning. So these guys knock something out because it fit with their philosophy, and we're going to get more abortions, not less, because of this action by abortion opponents. Always interesting. So the borrow from the Donald, very smart. Yeah, right. Because that's the type of thing he would tweet. And we did not see this also when a repeal of Obamacare failed. We do not see any plan to change the tax codes, and I refuse to call anything that was going to inject regressivity into the IRS code reform. I know they like to always call it tax reform, but it's only reform when you're making positive changes and interjecting progressivity. People in the administration may be individually competent. There seems to be some people with distinction that are appointed, but the overall team, the way it comes together, it takes the title of this old Jimmy Breslin book, Can't Anybody Here Play This Game? A good executive builds a good team, and that just did not happen here. Maybe it'll occur down the road, but nothing to date suggests that anytime soon. It's really like an accidental administration. In City and State this week, an old friend, Bruce Jory, and I knew him when he was almost like a teenager. I think Arthur knows him. I think Tony knows him. Recalled a comment in City and State newspaper or magazine of Professor Richard Neustadt, who's a presidential scholar. He wrote a great book called Presidential Power. It's really one of the great books about how a president can succeed. And Professor Neustadt wrote, "The presidency is no place for amateurs." And that's really what we're dealing. Perhaps a saving grace of sort involves that all the eyes on the doings of this administration, because it's an administration where ignorance, lies, and bad policy really rule the day. So we have a situation where the same attention, actually more so, that was given to the Trump campaign during the election in the print, in the cable, and all that media coverage, puts the foibles of Team Trump in our daily consciousness. So in essence, he got elected to some extent by playing the media, and now all that attention, because their ratings covering this guy still stays up, and their ratings are even higher than during the campaign. And as a result, that free coverage now keeps this administration to a large degree in check, even if Team Trump doesn't realize it that way, because they're still doing the same playbook of working the press and trying to feed it as best they can. So, you just watch the news, read the papers in print or online, and cable and Twitter and Facebook. There's just no end in how this administration is getting covered. And many things the Trump administration and the GOP may seek to undo, especially on the environmental side, may really play out in court or a rulemaking process that could take us to a new administration that appears, at least likely, according to the polling we have now. And there may be some people who might argue this administration may come to an end much sooner, but it's not part of my talk. But on the way in here, that was a little part of a discussion. So the budget process and the Hastert rule, remember the Hastert rule? And it's a rule that requires a majority of the majority. So it's a majority of the majority rule. So that makes it hard for a divided GOP House of Representatives to reach any consensus on difficult issues. Of course, some people think it's great that we should always mention it's the Hastert rule because of what caused him to sort of leave Congress. Not to that I want to have to mention it, but not a good thing. And further, we also learn how language matters, because apparently more Americans found fault with Obamacare. We were talking a little bit about that before we started to talk. But many of these same folks appear to be very happy to rest secure with coverage under the Affordable Care Act. Just fascinating. So one of the things to watch for is if Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, takes any actions that weakens healthcare delivery under an act that basically followed Romney Care and many nods to GOP imperatives, despite the refusal of any Republican to support the bill when it was passed under a Democratic Congress. So if Secretary Price acts, we actually may end up seeing a public clamor in support of single payer, a Medicare for all system. And as I mentioned before I spoke, my research and writing on single payer demonstrates that it offers a more cost-effective care program than the current system, and it pays for itself. So in many ways, the media and the commentary and the commentators appear to lower the bar on the expectations of this presidency, and I think that's one of the things we're seeing. So it's like we don't really expect a lot of success here, and when something sort of happens, it gets some play. But there's just so many faux pas, and just consider some. There was that call to Taiwan during the transition, and then more recently the call to President Erdogan from Turkey, who probably is on his way, and it really troubles me, on his way to a dictatorship. And then how the president repeatedly demonstrates an extraordinary lack of knowledge about foreign affairs in general, probably in many ways the least educated and least knowledgeable person to ever step into the Oval Office in that role. He had no problem antagonizing the leaders of our allies, Australia, Germany, Mexico. To have a diplomatic mess with Australia, one of our best allies, and it was there always sending troops to different conflicts that we were involved in, just over the refugees. The many threats he made with Mexico. All the craziness, including mentioning wiretapping with Angela Merkel, and then suggesting that the United States confiscate Iraqi oil. There seems to be no end. And then here's some more. Obviously, the refusal to release the tax returns. And I think that will come up in a lot on the questions and answers. And then even disputing the size of the inaugural audience. Why did he have to do that? And then we go to the ties with Russia and its influence of the election results. The last fall in my talk here, I did make clear, and a new book that's out today also supports the view I made, that the Clinton campaign still lost that election. And I didn't even raise all the false equivalencies when the president hits his predecessor on playing golf, as he did often, and now the current president has already spent more time on the links than his predecessor did in 8 years. And then there's the argument that he made that millions voted illegally in the November election. And here's some interesting things. And this just 2/3 of the way in, if you will, in the first 63 days in office. The Washington Post reported that the president he only made, and I said, I'm maybe having fun with it, but he only made 317 false and misleading claims. So it's about 5 a day. And then through March 30, there were 32 press briefings. And I love the press briefings. It's great theater. Whenever I'm near a TV set, whenever there's a Sean Spicer does it, I love to watch it. But 22 out of 32 press conferences, about 2/3 of them, were dominated by the tweets the president made. It should be all, when I think about messaging and about strategizing and doing what you're supposed to do, that's taking time away from that. You should be using the precious time to advance an agenda, and responding to tweets is not advancing agenda, especially those tweets are not about advancing a policy agenda. Maybe he thinks so, but I guess he doesn't know enough to know. So we can only hope for some professionalism with a lowered bar, perhaps, but I'm really doubtful it would occur. So what we really all need to be is vigilant, to watch and really speak out. So I'm going to end with a couple of perhaps movie titles that could be applicable to what's going on with this administration. Yeah. Well, one that was suggested was very simple: The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. Somebody else said Swamp Fever. Somebody else shared with me The Madness of King George. Somebody else raised a James Bond movie. Anyone want to venture a guess? From Russia with Love. And Somebody else even suggested a John Belushi movie, Animal House. I don't know if I'll go that far. Silence of the Lambs, and then I'll end with Land of the Lost. So it's really an upsetting, troubling thing that we face. But again, just going back to it, the fact that there is so much coverage and scrutiny that is out there because of cable and the TV. What the New York Times did by essentially taking really some of the best reporters that they could call that were started in City Hall in New York, who really know this administration and have ties where people in the administration who came out of New York are comfortable essentially speaking to them off the record all the time because we're reading about all these leaks. There's going to be so much that I think helps sort of quell or keep this administration from doing too much damage.